Dear listeners and viewers of Cover Hub and Radio Candid, Namaste and good afternoon. Welcome to the very special interview with Professor Harsh V. Pant. Professor Harsh Pant is Director, Studies and Head of the Strategic Studies Program at Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi. And he holds a joint appointment with the Department of Defense Studies and King's India Institute as Professor of International Relations at King's College London. He is also non-resident fellow with the Wadhwani Chair in US-India Policy Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Washington, D.C. Professor Pant has been visiting professor at several reputed universities, such as University of Pennsylvania, McGill University, University of Melbourne, and others. His most recent book include New Directions in India's Foreign Policy, Theory and Praxis, India's Nuclear Policy, the US Pivot and India's Foreign Policy, Handbook of Indian Defense Policy, India's Afghanistan Model, and the US-India Nuclear Pact Policy Process and Great Power Politics. Today we'll be discussing India's foreign policy with Professor Pant. Professor Pant, welcome to our show. The first question for today is, what are the current foreign policy priorities and challenges of India?
Thank you, Pramod, for having me as part of this conversation. When you look at Indian foreign policy, of course, it is constantly evolving in response to what is happening around India in the international environment as well as within India. But I think at the moment, if you look at the various priorities that India might have, I think that the topmost one would be primarily at ensuring that there is relative stability in the wider region in which India operates, so that it can continue to focus on domestic economic development. At the end of the day, a strong economy is one of the most important markers of any country's global aspirations. So unless the economic fundamentals are sound, unless Indian economy is doing well, I think India's role in the global order in the wider region will remain constrained. So I think for most policymakers, it is important to focus on internal capacity building, internal development. But I think increasingly we are living in a world where domestic and foreign, the differences between domestic policy and foreign policy are getting blurred. And I think that is a more very important message that is coming out from across the world at this point, where in a post-COVID environment, countries are having to deal with both, on the health front, the health crisis, and the economic front, the wealth crisis, as well as, in trying to figure out a response to so much that is happening around the world, from major power contestation to once again perceived growth in extremism and terrorism, to the wider challenges in the maritime space, to new technologies that are emerging and reshaping the way we live, we work, we think, and we operate. I think all of these challenges are profoundly serious and are having a significant impact on the way most nations are thinking about their foreign policy priorities. India is no different. But I think as the COVID-19 situation stabilizes, hopefully, the challenge for India would be to build its own economy back on track, to bring its economy back on track, as well as to use or try to shape the regional and global environment which allows India to fulfill some of its domestic aspirations.
Professor Pant, you just mentioned about COVID-19. So where is India's neighborhood policy headed under the Modi government, especially during and after the COVID-19?
I think this has been a very challenging time for all nations, including India and India's neighbors. And in that context, I think India's neighborhood policy in the last 1.5 years has also responded to some of the challenges that India and India's neighbors have been facing. So you would recall, for example, from the very beginning, India was one of the few countries to say that, look, this pandemic cannot be resolved by countries turning inwards. We have to work together. And in fact, at that point in time, even Prime Minister Modi convened a conference of all SAARC nations, of all nations in the neighborhood. Pakistan was also invited. So, in a sense, that was the first phase of the crisis. It was the beginning of the crisis. And India was arguing that India really cannot tackle it on its own. It needs the support of its neighbors to tackle it, because we live in a neighborhood which is, where the boundaries are porous, where borders are porous, where people interact with each other all the time. This is a region where people-to-people ties are very strong. So it's very difficult to become, to change the way we operate on a day-to-day basis. So therefore, regional cooperation was very, very important. And in that spirit, I think if I'm in the first phase, in fact, we saw India using some of its global manufacturing capacity to reach out to its neighbors, supplying PPE kits, supplying medicines that were needed at that point in time. And then, of course, moving on to vaccine diplomacy. But I think what happened, and the first phase of vaccine diplomacy, of course, was largely focused on India supplying it to its neighbors. But then you had the second wave, and I think in India, and that second wave earlier this year, March, April, really blindsided Indian policymakers, and it was very difficult to, because the resources were limited, and I think the scale of the crisis was of a very different magnitude. And at that point in time, then India started prioritizing domestic consumption in its vaccine diplomacy. So I think we have seen India not exporting, not supplying vaccines since March, April this year. And given that the production capacity, I think, of the manufacturing industry was also coming down. And now that I think India is back on track with its own vaccination program, and the supply of vaccines, that issue is once again getting normalized. I think very soon we would see India once again engaging with the neighborhood. But I think two important points on the neighborhood policy. One, that compared to the past, India's neighborhood policy is being shaped also by the rise of China. And China is now one of the most important partners of almost all of India's neighbors. And that will continue, because China is a growing power. It's a power that has resources, and therefore it is important for India's neighbors to engage with China as well. But I think this dilemma that India faces, and I think to a certain extent India's neighbors also face, how do you balance China and India in their foreign policy priorities? And how can India make sure that it remains a positive player in the region? Those challenges will remain with Indian foreign policy for some time now, given China's role and its expanding profile. The other thing, which very briefly I will touch upon, is of course the issue of Afghanistan and what has happened in Afghanistan with the coming back of the Taliban to power. Now, I think this will once again have significant consequences for the region, because this is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious region, and any attempt to, where religious extremism becomes on the rise, that challenges the stability of the region. So I think for some time now, India's neighborhood policy will have to focus more on its western frontier, the Pakistan-Afghanistan belt, because for a long time now, India had been focusing on the eastern flank, the whole BIMSTEC, Bay of Bengal, Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Myanmar and Thailand. Those were the focus areas for India. But now with the Taliban coming to power in Afghanistan, it raises some significant security concerns for India, and I think the focus is likely to be shifted towards that geography.
Thank you, Professor Pant. You just mentioned about Afghanistan. Will the Indian government acknowledge Afghanistan under Taliban rule? What transpired the Indian and the Taliban talks earlier this month? Does this indicate the shift in Indian policy?
Well, what India was likely, my own sense is that India, there is a new reality in India's neighborhood. And whether, India has always had this consistent position that the political process in Afghanistan should be Afghan-owned and Afghan-led. And now that Taliban are in power in Afghanistan, I think more or less, India will engage with the government in Taliban like the other countries would. That here is a reality that cannot be, you cannot shy away from that there is a government and you have to deal with them. But I think legitimacy and recognition are two different. It's still some way off. I think engagement to serve the interests which are immediate interests for India. India will continue to see that its nationals are protected, that those who have helped India in the past are protected, that India's stakes are preserved. That requires a certain level of engagement with whoever is running Kabul or whoever is running Afghanistan, and that would involve India reaching out to the Taliban. But I think recognition, and I think that is something that India has been saying now repeatedly, whether it is, and India, not only India, but other countries have also been saying it, whether it is the BRICS platform, whether it is, India and Australia yesterday in their own joint declaration, whether it is India and in other countries, like-minded countries, the sense that, that India will have to wait and see what Taliban actually do on the ground. Because there is a lot of commentary out there that this is a new Taliban, that this is a Taliban that has changed. But if you look at the government there, it's not an inclusive government that they have announced. It's an all-male and largely Pashtun government they have announced. They have not brought in other stakeholders to the table. They have been brutal in dealing with their political opponents. The fate of the Panjshir Valley, for example, is a case in point. If they were interested in a negotiated political settlement, they could easily have reached out to the fighters in Panjshir and made a deal. But they I think continue to use violence as a means of appropriating opponents. And so there are larger questions about what happens to political minorities, religious minorities, what happens to women, what happens to what is their governance agenda, if they at all have any. So I think those questions are important. But India's, I think the one that you pointed out is that India had this first official engagement with the Taliban in recent weeks. That was largely also, it's interesting that it happened at the behest of the Taliban. And India made 2 points. One, that evacuations should happen without any problems, and that those Indian nationals and other nationals who want to get out of Afghanistan should be allowed to get out of Afghanistan. And the other point that India continues to reiterate is that Afghan soil should not be used at targeting other nations when it comes to terrorism. And Taliban have indicated that they are open to it, but we know that verbal commitments in foreign policy, in international relations, don't mean much. It's always the actions on the ground that matter. And I think India will wait and see what Taliban do, what will they do over the next few months, how they relate to other stakeholders, what do they do with the minorities in Afghanistan, and therein India would try to chart out its own course. But I think it's at this point, while engagement with Taliban has become a necessity, a practical necessity for India, I think recognition is still somewhere off.
Why did India play a neutral role during the crisis in Myanmar and Palestine? How far can India continue with sitting on the fence, not taking side in its foreign policy?
Yes, I think that's an interesting question because there is a demand for India, and many in India also believe that India should be playing a much larger role in global politics. But that means that India and countries that want to play a larger role are also required inevitably to pick sides, because you really cannot be neutral all the time. Now, in the case of Myanmar, for example, if you look at India's engagement in Myanmar and India's role in Myanmar, that is primarily aimed at engaging all the stakeholders, because traditionally India has been a big votary of a democratic transition in Myanmar. But what has also happened is that India has great relations with the military junta there. And that military security agencies have been an important partner of India in tackling border problems, in tackling insurgencies along the border, and have been very helpful for India in managing that periphery, those areas. So it's not the idea that somehow the questions are India will continue to raise questions about democracy in Myanmar, but I think India has to balance that with the question of its security concerns that emanate from Myanmar. And India has to look at various stakeholders and bring them all together, because you would recall that even in the past, when the first when the political transition was happening, India was the only country that had channels of communication open to all the stakeholders, and that allowed India to be able to have an engagement both with the National League for Democracy as well as with the military untitled level, which perhaps no other country had. So there are some advantages of being able to engage with everyone, with all the stakeholders. But in India's case, in this particular instance, it is also important for India, from strategic and security reasons, that India continues to remain engaged with whosoever is running the government, and that India really, as we were talking in the case of Afghanistan, there are some practical issues that have to be taken care of. For India, in Myanmar, security is one. Border security is very important. Insurgencies in the border areas are very important to be tackled, and for that, India needs the help of the Myanmarese military. So I think this will continue to be a question of balancing both sides. But I think it is also important that when it comes to Israel and Palestine, India's stand is no different from other major powers. India's stance is very similar to what Western countries take. India wants the two-state solution to be implemented, and India wants that terrorism should not be the means of operation for those who want a two-state solution in Israel. So I think India's relations with both Palestinians and the Israelis have been strong and have continued to grow. But I think on the issue of Israel and Palestine, India is certainly not taking a position that is quite distinct from other major powers. And I think it is also interesting that this is certainly given that India is a democracy. This question should be asked of India. But if you look at other countries like China, China is exactly more or less the same situation arises, that China continues to have relations, or China has no compunction in having relations with all stakeholders in any country. And I think that gives China leverage that other countries don't have. So I think for India as a democracy, it is important to speak about democratic values. It is important to speak about people's rights and their aspirations. But as a nation state, it will also be incumbent upon India to look at its own security, to look at its own strategic interests, and therefore that can only happen if India has a broad-based engagement with all stakeholders in any particular situation.
How has India perceived China's new maritime rules designed to control the entry of foreign vessels in what Beijing calls Chinese territorial waters in the disputed seas of South China? Is it likely to cause more rift or spike tension in the South China Sea?
See, definitely. I mean, there is no doubt that China is gradually trying to exercise the kind of control in South China Sea that is quite unprecedented, that is detrimental to regional stability, that is also making smaller states in the region very, very anxious. And that is going to further escalate tensions in an already very, very volatile part of the world. South China Sea today has become extremely volatile because Chinese aggressive actions are now leading to counter actions from other states. The Western powers are now making a big play of their naval forces in that part of the world. And for India, it is important to uphold the values of freedom, inclusivity, freedom of navigation, because that is where India connects with the smaller states in the region. And that is, India is not speaking simply on behalf of India. Of course, there is an India element there. India's trade is there. Significant amount of trade passes through South China Sea. India would want that part of the region to be devoid of any conflict, to be devoid of any hegemonistic designs. But it is also about smaller states and someone in a country like India speaking up for them. After all, most of the South China Sea claimants are smaller than China. Their claims, this contestation has been going on for a while, and major powers are now entering the fray. And so the question is no longer simply about the discourse; it is also about the operational capacity of some of the countries to shape the strategic environment in South China Sea and in Southeast Asia more broadly. And I think India has important stakes in the wider Indo-Pacific, in South China Sea, in Southeast Asia, and India would like that region remain stable. And anything that adds instability, volatility to that region is something that India would not like, and India would speak out against. So I think there is it's gradually becoming clear that India want to not only talk about certain aspects of fundamental principles that need to operate in maritime relations between nation states, but also India recently sent its naval forces in South China Sea in the Pacific to undertake military exercises with like-minded countries. They involve bilateral exercises with countries like Philippines, Indonesia, but they also involved the Quad Malabar exercises in the Pacific. So I think there is a wider role here for India, which India is just beginning to play, think about and operationalize in the region.
How can the US and India work together on neutralizing China's growing presence in the region?
I think India and the US broadly look at the region through similar lens, and that has been one of the reasons why the relationship between the two nations have been growing, despite some challenges in US-India relations. The wider trajectory of US-India relations have been very positive. And we have seen different governments come in India. We have seen different presidents come in India. But the relationship has only grown. And there is a reason for that, because the larger strategic map that the two have of the region and where their roles fit in is largely the same. Now, for the US, there is this sense that there is a power transition happening, that a power like China that is opposed to a lot of the institutional frameworks and normative frameworks that America and the Western-led order had proposed over the last few decades is coming under challenge because China is opposing them. And for India, of course, the relationship with China is becoming more and more difficult to sustain. China is putting pressure on India along the border. China is making sure that India is not part of global platforms like UN Security Council. China is working with Pakistan to present India with a two-front theater. So I think there are challenges, and the wider Indo-Pacific, as we were discussing with reference to your previous question, that in the wider Indo-Pacific, maritime instability because of some of the actions of the Chinese have caused a lot of problems. So for India and the US, therefore, it becomes imperative to work with each other. India certainly on its own cannot manage this transition. America on its own cannot manage this transition. They both need partners. They both need like-minded partners. And not only India and America need each other, but they also need a wider set of partners. So we have seen, for example, quadrilateral security dialogue take shape with the Japanese and Australians. We have seen great engagement with ASEAN member states. We have seen European Union engaging more and more in the Indo-Pacific with India. And so I think there is a larger a shift happening in global politics, where the fragmentation in global order between China and its friends and slightly more democracies on the other side is beginning to emerge. Now, how far it will go, what sorts of costs and challenges it will need to still to be reckoned with. But I think for both India and the US, this is an inflection point in global politics. And unless they work together, I think there is a feeling that they won't be able to manage the extreme flux that we are witnessing in the system, in the Indo-Pacific in particular.
Thank you, sir. So you just mentioned about Quad and the Indo-Pacific. Let's have more clarification on it. In what way does Quad represent India's interest? What is India's role in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, India is the Indo-Pacific geography that has emerged. It's a new nomenclature, relatively new nomenclature, although traditionally it has been used in the past. But ever since the end of the Cold War, we had not seen this term being used. Instead, the wider Asian region was bracketed into various distinct parts. Like you had the Asia Pacific, and people used to talk of South Asia, as if South Asia is not part of the Asia Pacific. So you always had this arbitrary distinction that was made conceptually, that was made operationally. For example, American military commands were based on this interpretation, which was quite not in sync with the operational realities on the ground, but it was what it was. And India also, of course, was largely an insular power and not the kind of economic heft it has. And of course, China was emerging, but still it was relatively smaller power. So what happened once China started rising, and its impact was being felt from Oceania to Middle East and beyond to the east coast of Africa. I think that the challenge became that here is a new, geography that needs to be looked at. One cannot look at Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean in isolation, because the balance of power in the region was shifting. China's rise was making it impossible to ignore these new realities, and India's economic rise, made it possible to think of India as a balancer in the region. So, therefore, when you bring all these elements together, you sort of look at the Indo-Pacific configuration differently. So Asia Pacific became Indo-Pacific because South Asia was being looked at more organically as being part of the larger Asia Pacific. So once you start doing that, the distinction between Indian Ocean and Pacific Oceans becomes arbitrary. And I think that is the reason why we have seen the rise of the Indo-Pacific narrative in such a strong way over the last decade or so. And it is now being accepted by the countries in the region: Australia, Japan, ASEAN, European Union, America. All of them now are looking at the larger Asian region through the prism of the Indo-Pacific, because that's what the story that it tells you is that the center of gravity of global politics and economics is shifting to the Indo-Pacific, and therefore major powers there will have to recalibrate their own positions. And India, because India was historically, organically linked with Southeast Asia. So India's, for example, if you look at India's historical engagements with countries like Thailand and Myanmar and Indonesia, then it was not something that India was creating or that India was trying to establish artificially. The linkages are very clear, cultural, historical linkages are very substantive, but somehow they had been, they had not been seen as part of the discourse. And India was not seen as part of East and Southeast Asia organically. But now, as India enters into East and Southeast Asia through economic engagements, through maritime engagements, the logic of the Indo-Pacific is becoming clearer. And for India, it allows India to play a larger role in the wider Indo-Pacific geography, in the wider maritime space, where India traditionally has had a larger role in the past. But over the last few decades, it had certainly not lived up to that historical commitment. But I think that is changing, and that means that the instability or that power transition, the structural shifts, the institutional weaknesses of the region will be front and center in Indian foreign policy priorities. And so we have seen India, like other nations, grappling with this issue that while we talk of the Indo-Pacific, there are no institutional frameworks in the Indo-Pacific to manage the power transition in the region. And so Quad, as an informal grouping, as a platform, allows these like-minded countries to shape some kind of a security architecture for the region, because the four Quad countries are like-minded in more ways than one. Their strategic interests converge. They're all democracies. They have similar worldviews, and they have they want to preserve certain basic stability in the region, in the maritime space, because it's good for them, and they believe it's good for the region. And this convergence brings the Quad member states together. Of course, China has a problem. China doesn't like it. China feels that this is about its containment. But if you look at the uh, agenda that the four Quad countries articulated in their first leaders level summit earlier this year, that agenda is much more than merely targeting China. It is a very positive agenda. The agenda is about climate change. The agenda is about SDGs. The agenda is about health and vaccines. The agenda talks about supply chain resilience and trade in a world that is being reshaped by COVID-19. So on a range of issues, there is a sense that the four countries can mobilize regional resources, that can mobilize the region towards attaining positive outcomes and towards creating some kind of a stable institutional architecture in the region.
Thank you, sir. A strong political push for an economic decoupling from China has been a hot topic of political discourse in all the Quad countries, including the European Union and G7. How do you see the potential role of initiatives like Blue Dot Network or B3W, Build Back Better World, in this process, and how feasible is it for India to actually decouple from China?
I think what is, one of the things that COVID-19 has done, and COVID, it opened the eyes of the world, and in particular some of the major countries, towards the challenges that come when you are over dependent in your supply chains on any particular country. And Indian Prime Minister said it very early on in one of his remarks when COVID had just struck India, that one of the biggest lessons we are learning is that we need to be self-reliant in certain critical areas. So, and this is something that, as you mentioned, it is being talked about in the US. After all, the whole logic of Trump and Biden's foreign policy is about building America's domestic strengths. It is being talked about in the European Union, where there is a sense that over-reliance on China has come with costs, and it is happening in Australia and Japan, etc. So I think there's a recognition of the issue that you cannot be overly reliant on any one particular country. The old framework of globalization perhaps is something that needs to be relooked at, and that I think that is already happening. I personally think that it's certainly not feasible and not desirable also to have a complete decoupling from China, because China and India as economic partners, its economic relationships cannot be constructed overnight. Supply chains cannot be constructed overnight. So I think what is going to happen is gradually you will see certain sectors which are critical, which are strategic in nature, where India is trying to make a case that we will not allow certain countries to become dominant, where we will not allow India to become overly dependent on one particular country. And those critical sectors, will be firewalled against certain nations, so that the strategic autonomy of decision making can be preserved. And I think that is how gradually you will see this move towards. In India, it's called Atmanirbhar Bharat, the self-reliant India, and in other countries there is America First. So you have the sense that countries are now looking at this notion of how the world is changing and how the economics and national security dynamic are interrelated through a different lens, and the relationship with China is being reevaluated. It would not be possible to have complete decoupling, but I think what most major powers or countries want is to have a more reciprocal relationship, a more balanced relationship. If China wants entry into Indian markets, for example, then it should provide India with access to its own markets on issues where India has competitive advantage. Pharmaceuticals, IT, services sector. There, and that is something that China has not been forthcoming. China has not made it easier for Indian companies to operate in China, but China expects to operate in Indian markets freely. And I think that narrative, that paradigm is I don't think will be acceptable anymore. It is changing in India, it is changing elsewhere. And I think the larger narrative on globalization itself is undergoing a transformation where we are seeing a larger fragmentation of the global economic order. Again, the consequences are still unknown, but I think that the direction is perhaps much more certain.
This year, Prime Minister Modi personally wished Dalai Lama on his birthday, and US Secretary of State Antony Blinken met a representative of Dalai Lama in New Delhi. A move likely to anger Beijing. Does this mean that India is on its way to play the Tibet card in its dealing with China?
Well, I don't know whether India will be playing this card. I think for many in India, the relationship with Tibet is not really a card to be played. It's a much more organic relationship. It's a much more the way the Dalai Lama is revered in India and elsewhere also. It has very little to do with geopolitics or India's relationship with China. The Dalai Lama is just revered in India as a spiritual leader. He is revered around the world as a spiritual leader of Tibetans, and he's very well respected and loved. So in some ways, while India has in the past been a bit cagey about openly expressing it at times, how it views its relationship with Dalai Lama and the wider Tibetan community. I think what has changed is that post Galwan Valley incident, post this Sino-Indian tensions, I think there is a greater openness in India to ask a very basic question which one should ask in any relationship. That if China can be open about its engagement with all countries, including Pakistan. If China can, openly say or openly behave in a manner that is inimical to Indian interests, then why is it that Indian leaders are cagey about openly expressing their admiration for Dalai Lama? I mean, this is something that many in India have been asking, and many in India, I think, will continue to ask, because there is the ways, if China were more respectful of Indian sensitivities, perhaps Indians would want to be more respectful of Chinese sensitivities. But if it can't be a one-way street forever. And I think that's the challenge that Sino-Indian relations face at the moment. I think they are at an inflection point, and all the assumptions that have so far been made about Sino-Indian relations are now being reassessed. That doesn't mean that there is a Tibet card to be played. What it means is that India's ties with Tibetan people, India's ties with Dalai Lama will be openly expressed. They will be openly, India would not be reticent in expressing them. But certainly, if there is a need, then India will also make sure that the issue of Tibet, the issue of Dalai Lama, the issue of, what perhaps has been one of the more militarized responses to a minority religion in any country, can also be put on the international map. But I think at the moment, it's primarily what you talked about was Prime Minister Modi's regards for wishes for Dalai Lama. They have actually, been part of this landscape for a while. I mean, many Indian leaders have done it in the past. Prime Minister Modi himself had met Dalai Lama in the past. But perhaps this was something that, to bring it out in the open, the Prime Minister was signaling that, this is an important enough relationship for India to be sustained on its own merits, and one need not look at it primarily through the prism of China. If India has to talk about Dalai Lama, if India has to talk about Tibetan people, then it would do so, irrespective of what China feels or does, because ultimately, this is also a question of India expressing its sovereign will on a certain question, on on the region and on a certain question which has been which has been as much part of India's cultural history as of any other country.
Thank you, sir. Before we wrap up, let me ask last question on Nepal. At the moment, where does Nepal stand in India's foreign policy, and how is Delhi perceiving the political developments in Chatham?
Nepal, Pramod, has always been a very, very special case because I don't think any two countries have this kind of a relationship that India and Nepal have. And it's a very, very close relationship. It's at a people-to-people level, it's almost as if the two countries are the same people. But when it comes to the nation states, they always will have some divergence on certain issues where it's incumbent upon diplomacy in both nations to navigate them very, very carefully. So, because India and Nepal are so close, it also makes the possibility of challenges emerging much more palpable, right? So, if you are too close to someone, you also get hurt when the other side does not play by what you expect them to do. So, I think for India and Nepal, this has been a consistent pattern that while there is so much love and affection at the level of the people, at the level of nation states, we have always seen this, this challenge of how India is perceived, how Nepal is perceived. Sometimes people in Nepal feel India is his big brother trying to bully Nepal. Sometimes people in India would feel that Nepal is not really being sensitive to Indian concerns. But at the end of the day, I think what matters in India-Nepal relations is the ability to navigate these challenges, which will inevitably come. Because when you have such a close relationship, such frustrations, such sentiments are very natural. On both sides, there can be a sense of betrayal, there can be a sense of damage, but it is the role of effective diplomacy to weather it out. At the moment, of course, we have over the last few years, we have seen great ups and downs in the relationship, and we have seen also the fact that Nepal as a country has its own aspirations. It wants to play a certain kind of a role in the region. It wants to engage various powers in the region, and that I think in some ways is also a reflection of the way in which South Asia as a region is changing. It's evolving, and India's role in that context becomes not only looking at Nepal strategically, but also looking at Nepal as a co-partner in development, as a co-partner in the kind of regional developmental initiatives that are needed to remap the region or to look at the region differently in the global context, where so much is happening and there's so much potential. So my own sense is that India, of course, will have Indian policymakers will always look at Nepal very, very carefully, as I'm sure Nepalese policymakers do. And that will mean that you have to be extra cautious, extra sensitive, and you have to invest that extra bit in this relationship than you have to do in other nations. Because this is, given the special nature of this relationship, it is, I think, incumbent upon Indian policymakers to nurture it more and not to let this feeling grow that it is being ignored. Similarly, I think in the case of Nepal, a certain kind of a responsible leadership will always make it a point that Indian sensitivities are always, if not respected, at least acknowledged, that there to bring the relationship to an even keel. So I think on both sides, there is a lot of responsibility in nurturing this relationship, because we know from past experience that one single step in the wrong direction, one single policy misstep can really escalate into something very, very dangerous and something very, very difficult later on that eventually both sides have found difficult to manage. So I think it's in order not to enter into that phase, a little bit of caution, a little bit of sustained high-level engagement is very, very necessary. So I think Nepal will remain a very, very important, perhaps the most important part of its South Asia policy. And for Indian policymakers, it is very important to keep a close eye on how what is happening in Nepal, and I think in particular how the next generation in Nepal that is coming up, how that is responding, to their own aspirations. So what they are doing about what are their aspirations, how they are looking at their own role in the region, how they are looking at their role vis-a-vis India. And I think those questions will have to be engaged with by Indian policymakers much more substantively as Nepal also undergoes a generational shift, as Nepalese politics also undergoes a significant shift from the old patterns of the past.
Thank you, sir. Professor Harsh Vipant, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.